Hey friends, welcome back. So in today's podcast, we're going to talk about why so many people are unable to lose weight, why so many people are metabolically inflexible. I would like to share with you some nuances and details and keep it very practical, but also for those of you that are interested in the extra credit science, dive into some of the details about metabolic gridlock, this metabolic pushing and pulling concept, and why feeding fasting pattern and feeding window compressions paired with exercise and a low carb diet seems to make sense in conjunction with energy balance and not overeating energy. And so we're going to take a deep dive, and again, to keep it practical, but also for those of you that are interested, dive into the weeds a little bit into mitochondrial physiology and explore some of the intra-related and connected vicious cycles that make it hard for individuals, particularly maybe you, to lose weight, to burn fat, and how the different metabolic, sort of states in the post-meal window versus a fasting window versus an exercise window. So we're going to take a deep dive into that, and also then talk about how the fat cells themselves, as you gain weight, how that actually has this really sort of vicious cycle effect of preventing fat oxidation. We're gonna have a lot of fun here. I wanna welcome you back. It's Mike Mutzel. I'm grateful that you are here. I hope you enjoy this content. If you do, you can hit that like button. You can take a screenshot of this and share this over on Instagram. Be sure to tag me. The handle is metabolic_Mike. And what we'll talk about is, some of the referenced articles will be linked in the show notes. And as we go through this, I will flash up some of the images. So let's dive into it. So the paper that we're gonna lean on, well, there's two different papers. The main one that I really want to thank my friend Frida Turan for sending this over to me. We were going back and forth, and she did a lot of work to find this for me. So thank you, Frida. Unfortunately, I can't share this full text with you, like put the PDF out there, but I'll share some of the images. So the title of the paper here, and this was published in a Taylor Francis journal. The journal title is called Critical Reviews in Food Science and Nutrition. The title of the actual paper is The Continuum of Disrupted Metabolic Tempo, Mitochondrial Substrate Congestion, and Metabolic Gridlock Toward the Development of Non-Communicable Diseases. Now let's just quickly pause and talk about and define some terminology here in jargon. What is a non-communicable disease? So these are diseases that are created by diet and lifestyle choices and that are maladapted with human health. So for example, if we underexercise, if we overeat, if we don't adhere to proper circadian biology, if we never get into a state where we're not snacking all the time and we're constantly in the post-meal state, then we create non-communicable diseases. So these are lifestyle-induced diseases. So if we think about, for example, asthma is one of many non-communicable diseases. There might be a genetic element here. We can talk about type 2 diabetes. We can talk about allergies. We can talk about obesity. We can talk about autoimmune disease. We can talk about cancer. We can talk about heart disease. And we can talk about neurodegenerative diseases. Now, of course, there is a genetic element here. There are, situations outside of our control, how we were birthed, what sort of medications we were given when we were a child, if we were given antibiotics, that might predispose us to having a higher risk factor for developing, say, asthma or allergies or autoimmunity. But for the most part, obesity, heart disease, type 2 diabetes, and certain cancers are, and you could also characterize neurodegenerative diseases. There's a huge lifestyle element here. And so that's where we're going to focus in today and talk more about this metabolic flexibility concept. Now, it's worth mentioning many of these so-called pre-existing conditions or comorbid conditions that are linked with increased disease severity and hospitalization and death from COVID-19 are from these so-called non-communicable diseases. So these are diseases, again, that develop slowly over a period of time from eating poor foods and so forth. Now, the other article I just want to mention now, because I don't know that we're going to dive into it, it's a great article that was frequently referenced in this journal that we're going to talk about and highlight some details from today, is titled The Sedentary Revolution. Have we lost our metabolic flexibility? And so this was an article from some German scientists. But before we go any further, I would like to first address one of the many vicious cycles that we're going to dive into. And that is, it's important to understand metabolic pulling and metabolic pushing and what this really means. And so that we have a better grasp about feeding versus fasting and this idea of having a agile or flexible metabolism so that you can go without meals without getting hangry. And this is just going to be pro tip number one. If you get hangry in between meals, that's an indicator that you're metabolically inflexible. You would benefit from time restricted feeding. You would benefit from intermittent fasting. You would benefit from a 1 day a week, 24-hour fast. You would also benefit maybe from something like berberine hydrochloride, a natural product that can help support whole body glucose metabolism and blood sugar health. I'll put links in the show notes to some information more about that. You would also benefit from exercise, from walking. You might benefit too from a low carb ketogenic carnivore style diet. Okay. So we need to understand the post-meal window, and we need to understand how that's called metabolic pushing. And we need to understand the fasting physiology and how that's called metabolic pulling, where we're pulling energy from our fat stores. So let's just look here at figure 2. And so this is the metabolic pushing concept. This is what happens when you wake up and you have Wheaties and Pop-Tarts and a muffin. Okay. What happens to your body's metabolism? And if we're looking sort of with a telescope, and we telescope in on your body's mitochondria. So these are the energy producing organelles within your cells, within your liver cells, within your muscle, within your brains. So your mitochondria, about 10% of your body weight are attributed to these mitochondria. Very important. A lot of people have mitochondrial dysfunction. And if you continue to listen, you'll learn why that is and what you can do about that. So in the post-meal window, your mitochondria are really focused on glucose oxidation. So making sure that, all the macronutrients that were ingested in the meal are favoring this oxidation of glucose. So essentially, you have glucose as a 6-carbon sugar. It's split into two molecules called pyruvate. Pyruvate then goes into the Krebs cycle, starts to make Acetyl CoA and so forth. And there's just 2 more molecules that we have to talk about: citrate and Malonyl-CoA. So this is, again, citrate is made within your mitochondria through the Krebs cycle. So we're in the post-meal window, just keeping it practical as we talk about this. Your body's really favoring glucose oxidation. As a byproduct of that, you start to make a lot of citrate within the mitochondria. The mitochondria leaks out that citrate and it gets converted to Malonyl-CoA. Now, this is really important, friends. I know some of the names of the molecules are just jargonistic terms for some of you, but it's important to remember and focus in a little bit on Malonyl-CoA and how if you eat a lot of mixed meals that contain high carbs and high fat together, or if you eat a very high carb diet, or you don't exercise or you never fast, why Malonyl-CoA matters. Because it does 2 things that are considered unfavorable. Number 1, it prevents fats from being oxidized by going through the carnitine palmitoyltransferase protein. So essentially within your mitochondria, on the extracellular surface of your mitochondria within your cell, okay, fats can come through this carnitine transport protein, CPT1. Now, Malonyl-CoA inhibits fats from going through there. It basically shuts it off. So if you think about this, if you're constantly snacking, and this is where I think, the calorie gurus and the energy balance model kind of fails. If you look at the nuances of how metabolism works, if you're having a snack that contains carbohydrates and you're snacking every 2 to 3 hours and you're raising insulin and you're fostering glucose oxidation and all this, you're not able to then start to oxidize fats for energy, literally at the cellular level where fat oxidation occurs. So you're not able to get fats into the mitochondria where they are oxidized. So that's bad point number 1. Bad point number 2 about elevated Malonyl-CoA, persistent elevations that is it leads to the synthesis of de novo fats. So you're making fats from anew. So lipogenesis, de novo lipogenesis. So this contributes to the elevations of very low density lipoprotein. And so you can measure this. You can go to the lab, you can go to Quest or LabCorp, you can go to your doctor, your primary care doctor, and you can get your fasting VLDL, or you can get postprandial VLDL, or apolipoprotein B, APO B. I recommend maybe doing both. See, because APO B I think is a little bit more accurate. And you can see, is your VLDL elevated and is your liver enzymes elevated? If these are, this is an indicator that you have excessive metabolic pushing going on. You need to maybe, increase the dial on your intermittent fasting, lower the energy and or carbohydrates in your diet, and start exercising more. Because what happens with these new fats that are made elevated by having a lot of this citrate from glucose oxidation being poured into your cells, and then that raising this Malonyl-CoA is leading to increased fats being stored in your body fat. Now that's problematic because we're going to talk more about leptin and adiponectin and the changes within the fat cell and how those changes within the fat cells themselves exacerbate this process that we're just now talking about. So this is this metabolic pushing concept. Again, In the post-meal window, it's focused on glucose oxidation. And that can lead to, if you overdo it, if you overconsume carbs, especially if you mix carbs with fats, then you get this scenario where you have this elevated Malonyl-CoA. You literally can't transport the fats into your mitochondria where you need them to be oxidized. That's where fat is ultimately burned. And Malonyl-CoA is a upstream activator of synthesizing lipids from anew. So you start to make body fat and form fat. And that can overfill your fat cells and cause fat cell hypertrophy and all these negative things, okay? Which we're getting there. We're going to get into leptin in a moment. But first, we need to talk about the fasting physiology, or this metabolic pulling. So this is where you're essentially pulling energy from your fat tissue. You're pushing it through the mitochondria to make cellular energy. This is good in moderation. You don't always want to live in this state because this is characterized by adrenaline, noradrenaline, cortisol, catecholamines. So there are some stress hormones that transiently need to be increased to ensure that you're breaking down fat that are the stored triglycerides in your fat tissue, so they can be broken down into their constituent elements and shuttled through the mitochondria. But essentially, when you start to fast or you go for extended periods of time between meals, you're not eating all the time, or you exercise, you increase the switch. This is like the gas pedal to help with this intracellular oxidation known as AMPK. We've talked about this at length. Actually, a couple podcasts ago, we talked about AMPK elevations with exercise, with fasting, with natural compounds like berberine or metformin. So AMPK is a nutrient sensing enzyme, and it actually suppresses Malonyl-CoA's ability to block fats from being oxidized. So it kind of says, okay, look, I see you, Malonyl-CoA. You're taking a timeout. Fats, come this way, right? We've all been to the stoplight that's out of sync, or there's an intersection that's being, there's like road work going on everywhere in America right now, probably throughout the world. And so usually there's police officers that will say, okay, you guys turning left here, go ahead, and then everyone else wait. Well, AMPK is sort of like that. It's blocking Malonyl-CoA from suppressing fat oxidation. I know that sounds a little weird, but so in a sense, it's enabling more fats to be oxidized. So it's preventing Malonyl-CoA from affecting that carnitine transport protein. So that's good thing number one. And good thing number two, what it's also doing is it's affecting the ability of glycerol, which is, so if you think about your triglycerides that are stored in your body fat, that's how fat is stored, that backbone, triglyceride. So glycerol is part of that triglyceride. That's kind of the skeleton backbone. Then you have 3 fatty acids. So that glycerol can be made into glucose. So we do have a need for glucose. Your red blood cells, different neurons, parts of your eye absolutely need glucose. And so AMPK helps to improve this so-called gluconeogenesis and resynthesize glycogen and things of that sort. So that's what's helpful. AMPK does a few other things, but that's sort of this metabolic pulling concept. So, and again, this is really characterized by enhancing fat oxidation. So we're taking the fats from the fat tissue, we're using that glycerol backbone of it to make glucose for the eyes, for the red blood cells, and so forth. And then we're using those fatty acids to make energy in the mitochondria. So this is all good. Now, a lot of people never actually get to this state where they're able to oxidize fats and utilize mitochondrial function because they have weak AMPK signaling activation. They're not fasting, they're not exercising, they're not doing the things that I know a lot of you are actually doing. So that is characterized by mitochondrial congestion. So if we're always snacking, if we're not exercising, if we're overdoing the energy, if we're eating too many carbs, we have this gridlock situation where we have fats coming in because the signals are all messed up. There's insulin resistance going on, and there's basically metabolic gridlock. And this is where things get really fascinating. And I think if people have this sort of mitochondrial metabolic gridlock, and they've had this for a long time, they start to experience exercise intolerance. They start to experience fatigue. They start to experience muscle weakness, muscle catabolism. And this image actually really conveys the message quite well. And so this is figure 5 from the paper that we're talking about. And so this is this weird situation where your fat cells think that they should be releasing fatty acids because of the sort of conflicting messages, but yet we have that Malonyl-CoA issue inhibiting the carnitine in the mitochondria. So there's all this congestion and metabolic confusion, and ultimately what happens is your mitochondria start to uncouple. And what that means is instead of making energy, they become inefficient. And Ben Bickman talks a lot about this and how ketones actually reverse this uncoupling in the favorable manner. But your mitochondria is like, okay, look, we have too many raw materials to make cellular energy. We don't have the demand to make energy. So what we're going to do is become inefficient, and we're going to uncouple and essentially create heat instead of energy. Now, you might have heard of mitochondrial uncoupling when it comes to brown adipose tissue activation and cold thermogenesis. So we know that cold therapy and cold immersions and things like that, even the ketogenic diet might enhance browning of the beige adipocytes or the white adipocytes. But it turns out that this metabolic congestion from over-consuming energy, not intermittent fasting, not exercising, eating too much, things like that, that is creating this phenomenon where your mitochondria become uncoupled. And that's why sometimes when you see people that are overweight, guess what? They're sweating, their metabolic rate actually increases. And this is part of that because you're actually releasing heat as, instead of creating cellular energy. But the downside here is the fatigue, the exercise intolerance, the neurocognitive challenges, because the mitochondria in your brain mitochondria are really essential in the brain for neuronal transmission, for cell-to-cell communications, for memories and mood and affective behavior and all that. And so mitochondria are really important. So if you have this gridlock scenario, it's a challenge. And it becomes even more of a challenge because this is where we start to induce this insulin resistance, metabolic inflexibility concept, and how this then affects the fat tissue. And this is what I think is really important and worth sort of diving into, because what happens is your fat tissue starts to, again, because we're synthesizing lipids from anew, Malonyl-CoA is high, the carnitine transport's all boggled down and messed up and everything like that from what we've been talking about. And so the fat tissue starts to enlarge and you start to gain what's called adipocyte hyperplasia. So you've heard about hypertrophy in the context of exercise. So, when I move my muscles or you move your muscles, you're breaking down that muscle tissue, you get hypertrophy where the muscle fibers start to actually enlarge, which is good. But the challenge here with your fat tissue is you actually not only enlarge them, so you get adipocyte or fat cell hypertrophy, but you get fat cell hyperplasia. So you get new fat cells. And we're talking about in the orders of millions or billions. So if you start to gain 5, 10, 15 pounds a year over the course of 5, maybe 20 years, if maybe you haven't been exercising, you haven't been eating well, work's been busy and all of that, you're talking about possibly trillions of new fat cells. So, and these hypertrophied or enlarged fat cells, they start to release a lot of leptin. We've talked about this before. Leptin not only negatively impacts your mitochondrial physiology and also insulin sensitivity, but it also affects the immune system in a negative way by suppressing a key immune regulatory molecule called the T regulatory cell. And this is just a T lymphocyte. We've talked about white blood cells before. This T lymphocyte is responsible for preventing awry inflammatory responses. So chronic smoldering low-grade systemic inflammation normally would be sort of remedied by these T regulatory cells that are there to prevent, unrestrained inflammation essentially. But leptin has this effect of augmenting the cell from doing what it should be doing. So then we have a lot of inflammatory cytokines being released because we have high levels of leptin. And guess what those cytokines and inflammatory markers do? Well, a few different things, but number one, they further induce insulin resistance. So you can see this sort of vicious cycle starting to build up, right? Where maybe it started out with just, binge drinking and eating pizza on the weekends and then being hungover so you're not exercising and then having a busy work schedule and maybe having some kids and all that. And then 20 years later, you hear about fasting on the internet or you hear about the ketogenic diet and stuff, and you try this and it's really not maybe working right away and you're wondering why. Well, you've had this metabolic gridlock situation, you have overfilled fat cells, you have high levels of leptin, you have some challenges. Now, the other challenge, and again, it's not all doom and gloom, there's a lot we can do about this, but I want to highlight another sort of pathologic issue that is under-recognized but really important, and this has to do with hypoxia. So what happens when your fat cells start to enlarge and start to become infiltrated and filled up with energy because you're constantly doing this metabolic pushing, you're pushing energy in, Malonyl-CoA is high, your carnitine transport proteins all bogged down, so you can't oxidize fat, so your VLDL is high, your triglycerides are high, you're pushing energy into your fat tissue. your fat tissue sort of outgrows its own blood supply, its own water supply. Imagine a tree that gets so big that's maybe in like a little bowl. Pretty soon it's not going to have enough room for the roots to grow and all that, and it's going to start to die. Well, essentially your fat tissues are like that, your fat cells, because they get so big and enlarged and they run out of oxygen. And so they become hypoxic. Now, there's a key molecule that increases when tissues undergo hypoxia. This is called HIF-1, hypoxia-inducible factor 1 alpha. Now, what's interesting about HIF-1 is this also drives inflammation. So you can start to imagine here now, if we pause and think about why obesity or diabetes or these non-communicable diseases, why they're linked with poor COVID outcomes, because you have this chronic inflammatory response, you have these dysregulated T regulatory cells. I know it's a lot of jargon here. And then you have these aberrant or dysfunctional immune responses. I mean, it all kind of makes sense once we understand these nuances and these details. And so this HIF-1 alpha, this is a marker. It's involved in then changing genetic expression, driving even more inflammatory cytokine production, creating this chronic systemic inflammatory response. And then we have these problems, and this further exacerbates this metabolic gridlock and mitochondrial congestion. So, it's complex. And then also within that, the enlarged, engulfed adipocytes, they and leptin and all that then downregulates adiponectin, which is favorable. Adiponectin helps with insulin sensitivity. So you can see here how this is just this big complex web of just, it's like, man, there's a lot to unpack here. So I don't know that I missed anything, but I do want to sort of talk about that double whammy and just finish off on, okay, so that's all the bad stuff. That's all the sort of metabolic pathophysiology and all the challenges. So what do we do? So how can we unwind this big, interconnected mess here? Well, number one, we got to focus on this metabolic tempo concept. So feeding and fasting patterns. So we're not chronically overfilling our fat cells. We're not chronically doing this metabolic pushing where we're pushing a bunch of junk into fat storage. Okay, so that's one thing. So we got to focus on a balance of feeding window compression. So for just garden, to be super general, one thing that you can do is just focus on eating when the sun's out and fasting when it's dark. So this is a super simple thing that everyone can do. So if you're wondering like, hey, what feeding fasting pattern can I work on? Can I try? Eat when the sun's out, don't eat when it's dark. Now, I know for some of you in Latin America, that can become challenging because you don't start eating until 10 or 11 at night, right? But so we have to focus on some feeding window compression, and hopefully that's in harmony with the rise and fall of the sun and our natural rhythms of the environment. So that's number one, figure out a feeding fasting pattern that you can stick to. So if that's 16-8, if you can consistently do that, that's great. Now, do a little bit of mental inventory. If you've been insulin resistant, metabolically inflexible, haven't been eating good, haven't been exercising for years or decades, you might need to crank that feeding fasting pattern down a little bit. You might benefit from OMAD. You might benefit from alternate day fasting. You might benefit from 1 day a week fasting. So these are just things to consider because everyone is going to be a little bit different. If you're already at 12% body fat, alternate day fasting may not be ideal for you. Yeah, that might be a little bit too much. Now, again, to weave in the fasting to everything that we just talked about, fasting is going to help with this metabolic congestion. It's going to help pull some of the energy through the mitochondria, drop that Malonyl-CoA, open up that carnitine, palmitoyltransferase protein, so fats can come into the mitochondria and to start to be oxidized for energy and help prevent this mitochondrial uncoupling, particularly in the muscle tissue. So feeding fasting patterns are great. Exercise, really good. What does exercise do? It helps pull energy through your mitochondria because you have to create cellular energy. Now, the challenge for a lot of people is they don't have the energy to start exercising. Well, you can create energy by just starting to exercise. Just make it a habit. 5 minutes every morning, go for a walk. Increase that to 7 minutes, then 10 minutes, and pretty soon you're going to be walking for an hour, no problem. Now, you need to make time. A lot of us are busy. We have kids, we have obligations, we have jobs, we have all this. Okay, you need to make time to exercise because we want to prevent the further development of these non-communicable diseases that are really not impacted by a lot of medications in a significant manner, right? People, they have diabetes, they take, some sort of diabetic drug. Is that a long-term solution? Maybe it can help them while they're changing their diet and lifestyle, but ultimately we have to work on diet and lifestyle changes. Okay, so exercise, very important. Resistance training. So cold thermogenesis, going in the sauna, jumping in the lake, all these things are going to be helpful. There's some microbiome changes that we can get into, but circadian rhythm is really important. So we want to make sure that we're going to bed and waking up at consistent intervals and not going to bed sometimes and having this social jet lag where on the weekends we're going to bed at like 1 a.m, but during the week we're going to bed at 10 p.m., right? We want to be consistent with that because our body's metabolism and all these nutrient sensing receptors and enzymes that we just talked about, from leptin to adiponectin to mTOR to AMPK and all these things that we mentioned, these are all influenced by circadian rhythm physiology. So that's really important. We also want to focus on clean living. So we know that endocrine disrupting chemicals and things like that, they can interfere with these nutrient sensing enzymes and receptors and have epigenetic effects, meaning they're not changing our genes, but they're changing the way that our genes are being expressed. So that's important. Clean living, clean water, clean food. Those are all sort of important concepts. And then also consider your energy balance and making sure it's commensurate with your physical activity and your age. So if you're 65 and relatively sedentary, you don't need to, have 3,000 calories a day. So we do need to consider energy balance and then also matching the amount of carbohydrates we eat with, again, commensurate with our physical activity. So making sure that, and also the season. So right now, carbohydrates are coming into season as we record this in early summer. We're starting to get berries. Pretty soon we'll be getting apples, things like that. So it's good to eat in harmony with your body because there is some interesting data showing that your microbiome sort of changes throughout the seasons and you might be able to absorb and better assimilate carbohydrate foods from your environment and so forth. So all of these things really matter and they play a big role here. But I just thought these details were important. Now, in summary, there's also natural products, and I mentioned in adiponectin you can consider a high quality third-party tested omega-3. So omega-3 fats have been shown to favorably affect adiponectin, favorably affect some of these different fat triglyceride challenges and fat oxidation parameters and so forth. So you can consider that. I'll put links to some third-party products from Myoscience that I think are amazing. Also, berberine hydrochloride. So berberine, it does affect AMPK. AMPK, remember, it helps to facilitate fat oxidation. It helps to affect the mitochondria in a favorable manner to improve this metabolic pulling energy from your fat tissue through your mitochondria and helping with mitochondrial function. So you can do that, 1 to 2 capsules in the morning, 1 to 2 capsules in the evening. And again, it's like, well, everyone wants to know, well, how much do I take? When do I take it? It really depends on your metabolic inventory. Do you have a lot of metabolic debt or not so much? So if you don't have that much, then you can just do a little bit in the morning, see how you feel. The only time that you don't really want to take berberine is right before you exercise. Not that it's not going to cause any major challenges, but we want to AMPK and these different signals and so forth. We don't want to interfere with the mitochondria when we're exercising. We want to we want to have this sort of flexibility of when you're exercising, you want to be able to utilize both glucose and fats for fuel, not just focus on fats for fuel. So that's why I don't recommend that for exercise, because there is something to be said about burning sugar when you're training. You just don't want to be burning sugar all the time. So hopefully that, I don't know, but does this podcast resonate with you? I would love to know. I'd love your feedback. You can let us know in the comment section below or over on iTunes. The goal here was just to share with you some of the details that I think are super fascinating. And I know it gets a little complex, and that's why we were looking at these images to help better understand really these vicious cycles and how all these vicious cycles within the mitochondria, within the fat tissue, within the immune system, the leptin insulin axis, how all of these vicious cycles are interconnected, and hopefully how we can then knowing this information help reverse and analyze and test and look at different ways to change this. So as a bonus to this podcast, I do have my metabolic blood work cheat sheet. Become a subscriber to our email newsletter. The links will be below. We send 1 to 2 emails a week that are dense, jam-packed with science and information. And as a bonus for joining, you can get access to that blood work cheat sheet, which will be linked below. Also, you can save over at myoscience.com. Use the coupon code podcast on any of the formulations that we talked about. There's a lot of new great stuff that we're working on, like a new chewable vitamin D gummy that tastes phenomenal, a chewable zinc gummy. Kids absolutely love this. That will be linked below as well. And again, you can use the coupon code podcast at checkout. And friends, I'm grateful that you tuned in all the way. Hopefully you benefited from that and it wasn't too complex. And we will catch you on a future episode down the road. Until then, be well. Bye now.